What is going on, Sharp Football family? It is your resident Swami of Konami, Rich Hribar. We are here in the middle of June, knocking on the door of training camps where this thing really starts to snowball downhill into the NFL season. As a reminder, just some quick housekeeping at the top. You can go to sharpfootballanalysis.com. You can pre-order Warren Sharp's 2024 book. I just submitted my last team chapters, this past week. So my stuff is done. I'm ready to start focusing more on stuff for the NFL draft kit, which you can also pre-order on the site, or actually not even pre-ordered. It's just live on the site. Me and Raymond Summerlin are going to be adding to that the rest of the summer. And you can also sign up for the first wave of NFL futures. You can use promo code 20futures on the site for that. Like I said, we've got a great guest today for the site, for the show today. You can find her over on the Fantasy Focus podcast that is on ESPN every week. This next show will be this Friday with her at 12:30 Eastern. She just had a recent article on ESPN, covering some of the outlook for players returning from injury. Some of those we'll be talking about today, and she's going to continue to have content all summer long over the next couple months, on offensive players returning from injury, defensive players returning from injury, and unfortunately, the guys that are going to suffer some preseason injuries. That guest needs no real introduction, but I stumbled over it there. It's Stephania Bell at ESPN. This is the first time her and I have interacted. We followed each other for a while, on the former Bird app. So I'm excited to do our first show together. Welcome, Stephania.
Well, thank you for having me. I know I was very excited to get the invite. Big fan.
You're kind of the OG, fantasy injury analyst, and I have to imagine that, when you kind of got your degree and, were going out into the workforce and you were probably already, doing what you thought was going to be your career, that this wasn't the path that you would take. So I don't know if you can just briefly kind of share, the story of, your background in fantasy football and how it led to you now applying your degree and career to now doing the covering this great game that we all get to be a part of.
It's funny because I wasn't playing fantasy football yet when I was in grad school. It was a long time ago. You say OG, and I embrace that. Thank you very much, because there really was there wasn't a ton of injury talk out there, and I like to say I was the first full-time injury analyst. The injury has spawned a whole group of injury analysts out there who work to different degrees in terms of time and commitment, but there are a lot more people just talking about injuries. That I'm very proud of. To answer your question, I'm trying to give you the short version. I'm going to try and give you the short version here. Basically, I was always interested in sports. I've been a football fan all my life, huge consumer of football, and then started playing fantasy football in this league I was in, very competitive co-ed league. It was a great intro because it was baptism by fire. I mean, it was not a soft league whatsoever. But I noticed that people were coming and asking me a lot of questions related to injuries, like, you treat these athletes. What do you think? And there, you have to remember, this was, and I am, going to date myself here, but there wasn't a lot on the internet at all. Just to give you an idea of how sparse it was, the internet wasn't full of information like it is now. And so people were coming to me and asking, based on my experience, what I thought about prognoses, or if I had more details on injuries, et cetera. And so I found I was like, this information is obviously important to the people who play fantasy football. And I could see over the course of playing for a few years that the fantasy football industry was growing. It just so happened one of the people in my league, he made draft boards with his brother-in-law, kind of the early draft boards with the stickers. And then they got a contract with ESPN where those draft boards were distributed if you signed up to play fantasy on the site. So I saw that it was really growing. And I just wanted to get involved with writing some content. I had no thoughts of going beyond writing. And this friend of mine who was in league said, you should really go to what's now the FSGA, Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association. It was the FSTA then, Fantasy Sports Trade Association. You should go to a couple meetings. And I did. And I started meeting people and talking to people. There were no women there, really, none. I think I might have been one of two. If there were two, I'm not sure. But these were the old days in Vegas, like 2 hotels they used to host the conference in are gone now. They've been blown up. I mean, this is a long time ago. And, it was met with different degrees of enthusiasm. I think most people like the concept, like, oh yeah, that's information I'd like to have. But nobody had done it before. And I think that was the reason I kept hearing, yeah, but no one's going to pay you to do that. Like you can't, it'd be nice to have, but you're not going to be able to make a living at it. And I was like, well, I just want to try. I want to start writing. And so KFFL gave me my very first little spot to write, like inside somebody else's column. Peter Schenke of RotoWire picked it up, was excited about it, brought me to RotoWire. That was really where it kind of exploded for me. And I did more than football. I did baseball and some other sports. And then they started a Sirius XM relationship. So that got me on the air on radio. And that just kept going. And then when Matthew Berry went to ESPN, sold his website to them and was tasked with basically building their fantasy department, I was a bit of a unicorn. I was a woman who played fantasy football, who was coming at it from the injury perspective, and two things: not a lot of women, and nobody really dedicated to the injury content full time like I was willing to be. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, and you said like, oh, it was so long ago, but it feels like it until like the last like maybe couple years, like we never saw like an explosion. Like you got hired in, went mainstream, and then there was just like slow going. Like there was just no one else, and we started to see the last couple years a lot more people kind of carve their way into the space of injury analysis, because this is the part where I try to tell everyone, try to remind everyone, I'm not a doctor. I'm working at like all the information that everyone at home is, but I used to play fantasy football from the umbrella of injury optimism has claimed all of us at a time or two. Like, it's if playing football is hard at 100%, like if you're not going to be 100%. So like, I used to kind of be like, all right, well, I'm going to outright avoid this guy that's hurt. And, being able to follow you and some of the people, the Matthew Betts and Edwin Porras and, some of the other people in the industry that are joining up. It's like, all right, now the reason why people follow me is to get information based that they don't have. And I consider that why, following you guys in this space just gives me more educated opinions on something that like I'm not an expert on. So we're gonna get into that with some of these players here that I know people are looking at in drafts. They're wondering, should I click the button? Should I outright avoid these players? And every offseason that we kind of come into, it's always we have like just no shortage of guys coming off of an ACL injury, right? It's been the injury that surrounded the NFL basically since like I've been playing. It's like the top injury that everyone like kind of has like pause on. But ACL in recovery has gone such a long way. I mean, you're from the Bay Area. I know you still root for the 49ers. I got my guy Jerry behind me.
Yes.
Me and the goat are on a first name basis, if anyone doesn't know. But a lot of people remember when Jerry Rice, like he tore his ACL and he came back the same season. It like blew everyone's mind that he came back, and then he suffered
and then
like
he fractured his kneecap.
Yeah. Caught a touchdown reception. Yeah. But, back in the days, like you'd be like, all right, this is a 13 to 15 month, recovery for these injuries outside of, the Jerry Rice, the unicorn. And now things have kind of, advanced on beyond that. Can you just real quick, like talk about, the differences in ACL recovery from like when you first started and like where we are today?
The big change in terms of ACL rehab when I was first getting out of grad school was they were no longer casting people who had an ACL tear. So if you can believe this, it used to be that you got put in a cast and you were immobilized because they thought they had to protect the knee. And of course, we've learned that, biology, tissue biology, movement is really critical especially for joint health, so it might have kept the knee protected, but the compromise, the breakdown of the soft tissue because it wasn't getting stressed, the damage to the joint ultimately, and then trying to get your range of motion back was impossible. So picture guys trying to come back after being casted for ACL to then full range right now we see range of motion right away because you want to get your quad strength back, etc. And then it really hasn't evolved a ton in the sense of there's something I could point to you and say, well, we don't do this anymore. We do this. I think the key is early range of motion, getting your quad strong right away, getting your full extension of your knee right away. Those are kind of the key things. And if somebody has a problem there or gets an infection, that's when you can really have a setback early. And after that, everybody's kind of on a similar trajectory, give or take. Obviously, your past history comes into play. If you look at a guy like Nick Chubb, who had a horrible injury in the past, that changes how you approach his recovery from this second major surgery. But I think where it's really improved and where we're still trying to figure out how to get better is in that return to play window. So somebody gets ready, they look strong enough. Everything you could do in the clinic, they can run, they can do agility drills, things that, kind of baseline stuff for return to sport. But there's a big gap between that and then returning to your pre-injury level of performance. And that's now the benchmark that we use in medicine to determine how well did somebody come back from injury. It's not just did they return to play. That used to be the benchmark. Oh, they've been out and they returned to play. We're good. But when you start looking at performance after return to play, you start seeing major differences. And you've seen it. Just you don't have to be a medical expert to know when you've seen someone come back and be okay, but you're like, God, he just doesn't look the same as he did before the injury.
You brought up a player like Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb is in an interesting spot here, obviously, because he didn't have just an ACL, he had the MCL as well, which they had to wait on to heal. He doesn't have his surgery until mid-November of last season on his actual ACL. Typically, we would look at his age at the running back position and say, all right, even if he was fully healthy, we'd be factoring some like age decline for him. The Browns did him like a really nice solid. You like to see that from an organization. They could have released Nick Chubb for no cap penalty. They could have saved $11 million on the cap. Instead, they restructured his contract to make it so all of his money was guaranteed this season. He still isn't signed beyond the season, but they didn't have to do any of that. Obviously, it's a team that's playing to hopefully Super Bowl aspirations. They're counting on a guy like Nick Chubb late in the season. But putting all that together with Nick Chubb's age versus maybe a guy like, say, Jonathon Brooks, who's a 21-year-old rookie, like what are the differences between those two players, and the injury, and that separates their injury from not being the same and potentially, could impact either one of them being up to that play speed earlier or later this season?
We have big reasons to separate out Nick Chubb and Jonathon Brooks, but even two guys who had clean ACL tears, no other damage in their knee, just ACL, can have very different pathways back. And I think people need to remember that. But a couple of things that are different. So Nick Chubb, I mentioned that he had this multi-ligament knee injury previously. So when he was at Georgia, he had a horrible injury. It was PCL, LCL, and MCL. So people can understand. Yeah. You have four main stabilizing ligaments of your knee. You have your anterior cruciate and your posterior cruciate, and they form it's like this, like a cross on the deep inside the knee joint. So they control translation, like the lower leg bone relative to the femur, but they also control rotation. And then you have the MCL and the LCL. So medial collateral, lateral collateral on the sides of the knee. And that's more the side to side control. You don't have a lot of side to side play in your knee. So, if you get clipped, that's why clipping is such a big deal, because that would blow out the MCL. So those two are going to be easier to tear. The MCL much more so than the LCL. But the ACL and the PCL, there's usually, it's a combined movement thing that happens. When you have 3 out of the 4 stabilizing ligaments torn, like Nick Chubb did, and you can dislocate your knee, and it requires major surgery, there's all kinds of other tissue damage along with it, you might never walk the same way again. Nick Chubb got himself drafted into the NFL and became the player that we love, still one of the most pure runners in the NFL. If I'm watching a running back, Nick Chubb's one of the people I love to watch run. Big fan of his. Now he has another multi-ligament knee injury. Minka Fitzpatrick's helmet goes straight into his knee. There's no avoiding it. I'm not saying it was a dirty thing, not at all, but just that kind of contact, there's nothing you can do about it. And so now he has another multi-ligament knee injury on a knee that previously overcame more than you might have expected. It's really hard to know what his outcome will be. He's a guy who works as hard as you can possibly imagine. He keeps himself in great shape, probably helped him in this case. But with that kind of trauma on, as you mentioned, he's an older running back with more mileage, cumulative mileage on his legs. You just don't know. And that's why the Browns, when they say there's no timeline and they're not pressuring him to come back, I completely understand it. This is about doing as much as you can to help protect his leg for his life. Forget, playing football. So to me, for fantasy purposes, I don't even have a timeline mapped out for him. I don't expect to see him before the second half of the season. Would I be surprised if we didn't see him at all? No, I'm not saying that's the case, but this is going to be really dependent on how he progresses. Now, flip over to Jonathon Brooks, young at University of Texas, running back, electric, kind of Bijan Robinson part 2. And he tears his ACL, reportedly clean, so no other ligament damage, primary ACL tear, doing well in terms of tracking on his rehab. And you would expect him to be sort of similar to what we saw with Breece Hall if the Panthers approach it that way, work him in gradually, ramp up his activity as he recovers. But again, everybody can have little bumps in the road. The knee starts to swell on you a little bit because you do too much one day, you have to back off. It's kind of a give and take in terms of those final stages of rehab. They want him healthy for a long time. So the key is not to there's no point in trying to get him out there as early as can be. The point is to get him back when he's ready. But he has a much clearer path to returning than Nick Chubb, given the relative injury history. And just one more thing, relative to Jonathon Brooks, there was a study that the NFL did in looking at players at the combine who came in with a history of an ACL reconstruction. So whether it was, something that happened that year or prior, they had a much greater chance of having a repeat ACL injury within the first 22 months of playing in the NFL. And it significant enough that it made some people, this is why the stock drops a little bit on somebody who's coming in with an ACL tear. Now, once they get past the 22 months, they seem to level out to just the same risk of injury as anybody else. But those first 2 years, there is a greater risk of re-injury, either injury to the same side or more likely, more common, tear the other side.
That's particularly interesting for dynasty gamers that, we're trying to tell themselves the positive spin on Jonathon Brooks. There's definitely some risk involved there too. Even if you're in the redraft streets on Jonathon Brooks and you're looking for an outcome like Breece Hall, who he took he didn't play 50% of snaps until week 5 last year. He ended up being a fantasy hero for the fantasy playoffs. Obviously, if you made it there with him, there was a lot of Breece Hall, teams that probably didn't survive that to that point. If we do get there with Jonathon Brooks, post bye, the Carolina Panthers, their end of season schedule is pretty rough, but in the fantasy championship, you do have like the Buccaneers and a game against the Cardinals the week before, but Chiefs, Eagles, Cowboys are all in their back end schedule post bye when you're looking for, trying to Jonathon Brooks to be maybe that play speed to be up to the level where we saw Breece Hall at the end of last year. So we don't even get any schedule breaks really either there for Jonathon Brooks though.
And Breece Hall was big in the passing game.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Which I think Jonathon Brooks has the ability to do, but you just don't know how they're going to run their offense. So I think that's the other thing is you look at Breece Hall. I'm going to be really interested to see what happens this year with his run game, because he showed that he could do it, because very late in the season, I think it might have been the last week when he produced all those rushing yards. It was
the last 3 weeks.
Yeah. But there was one game in particular that I think he had over 100 yards rushing. And that is different than what he was doing in the earlier part of the season. So we'll see how, what it looks like with their quarterback back under center this time. But it is interesting, like his volume of work. That's a lot of volume for somebody coming off an ACL and also being a rookie. Breece had the advantage of getting his feet wet in the NFL previously.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real quick touch on Breece Hall, who obviously is now, basically a consensus top 6 pick in these fantasy drafts. Is there extra confidence now, like a full year removed? Is there anything like post ACL, like we should still be worried about, or like with him now having a full off season of recovery, fully healthy, like should that just be more of a wheels up situation for him?
Well, I think, that there's some of that risk that I talked about. That study focused on players who are coming into the draft, but we sort of know in sports medicine that there is this window where you are more at risk of tearing your opposite side. And you've seen it, we've seen players who come back and then you feel terrible, right? They come back, they look like they're performing so well, and down they go with another injury. So the risk is elevated in that early time back. But look, you can't prevent every injury. There's no way.
Yeah.
But the guys who really stick with some of the training, I talked about some of the more advanced training that happened that, we're seeing now with guys coming off ACL. Sometimes people get comfortable. They feel good. They're not really doing some of those dedicated, reaction time training or working on, certain skill sets that they're not using in the game. They're just doing football stuff. I think the ones who do the extra work are probably putting themselves in a better position to avoid a second injury.
We talked about some of the running backs. There's some other players that are coming off ACLs at different positions, required to do different things. One of them is TJ Hockenson, who had the most recent, injury. He suffered his ACL tear on Christmas Eve. If you remember that. And he's another one that had an MCL, had to wait. Where are we at with TJ Hockenson and the expectations? Because not only does he have this injury that he's got to come back from, when he comes back, I mean, he's going to be playing with a new quarterback as well.
Yeah, it's a lot. If you look at the timeline, when the season begins, he will be just over 7 months post-op.
Oh, yeah.
And, the sweet spot, ACLs are all over the place. And it makes me laugh. People love to refer to Adrian Peterson. And it's now that we're like a dozen years removed from Adrian Peterson's comeback, I think people recognize, okay, maybe he was an outlier. He was.
Yeah.
But like you were talking about before, I would be like 16, 17 months. And then it went way back. And I was just at a sports medicine conference in Birmingham, Alabama last week. Dr. Andrews, the famed Dr. Andrews, who actually operated on Adrian Peterson, is now retiring, and his fellowship graduates come back and do this research meeting every couple of years. And I was there. And the conversation about recovery from ACL was, we kind of looked out to a year and a half. That's what was happening. And then it got the idea that you could come back at 6 months, and everything was about return to play, return to play, return to play. How quick can you return to play? It takes a while to capture data, right? So after pushing so many athletes to come back sooner, started seeing rates of re-injury and actually performance metrics that were not great. And when you started holding people back, getting a little more confidence, and then you do some of that late stage return to play work before releasing them to play, everything improved. So now the sweet spot tends to sit around 9 months to a year. Now, sometimes that's dictated by the seasonal calendar, right? If you tear your ACL and you hit 9 months in June, well, you can't return to play for another 3 months. So it will be documented as a 1-year return, but you might have been ready to start around June. You see what I'm saying? So the timeline is always a window because we have to factor in the seasonal calendar, but 7 months at the start of the season is still pretty early. And this is a guy that they paid. This is a guy they have long-term plans for.
That's one of the tough things, especially at a tight end position where, we're mostly looking for a ceiling. There are a lot of guys that just are okay at tight end. Like you need like a true difference maker. And if we don't end up getting that, from TJ Hockenson, like I said, before we even get to him on the field, then we have a bunch of questions of the Minnesota Vikings, transitioning away from Kirk Cousins. We saw what that situation looked like last year. We assume that Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy are going to be improvement on what they finished the season with a year ago. But then we also have the enormous on-off splits that TJ Hockenson has had without Justin Jefferson on the field as well. So we haven't seen a lot of Jordan Addison, Justin Jefferson, and TJ Hockenson all in the field together.
The other thing is style of play. TJ Hockenson's a big guy, a big physical guy, and you want them to have confidence in their knee. But he takes a lot of punishment in his game, and he has to be able to withstand that. And sometimes there's an acclimation period, even after guys get back on the field, to really playing like themselves and getting comfortable playing football again. So it's not like he steps on the field and you're putting him in your lineup and expecting TJ Hockenson things. Maybe you get that, but it's often the case that there's a little bit less demand on them. They account for that and how they structure the offense. He's not going to be the go-to guy every time. And even he may not make the plays that you expect him to early on as he's getting reintroduced to football.
Yeah, and interesting thing too about the Jordan Addison thing. He was a guy like when I initially looked at things, I was like, oh, he had all of his spike production when Justin Jefferson was out, but then I started to dig into it, like where he was going in drafts, and he continued to slide. And I'm like, well, they're not going to have TJ Hockenson probably for maybe the opening. This let's just say the start of the season, and then they also didn't do anything to improve the wide receiver 3 situation. And this is a system that's historically run a lot of 11 personnel. I mean, right now.
Yep.
I mean, they're ending up with like a competition. Like Brandon Powell is like the front runner. So like, is Brandon Powell going to cut into targets for a guy like Jordan Addison? And we did see him at the end of last season. If you remember the
Yep.
Bengals game with Nick Mullins, he had a huge game with Justin Jefferson back on the field. So he's a guy that like I initially thought I was going to be hesitant on, but now I think he's just a little bit underpriced because we know these year 2 wide receivers and year 2 players in general have always been the hotbed for like fantasy guys to like over exceed expectations, young players. So definitely want to, keep the lights on for him. And then also, Jackson Smith and Jigba, in that same kind of price range too. Everyone kind of threw out. One of the
Plus, I
young
just think
widers.
Minnesota, I was just going to say, I think just Minnesota is so interesting to me because we just don't really know what it's going to look like and how the quarterbacking is going to change and when, and is,
I have
there's
faith in Kevin O'Connell though.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
right. He can make anyone look.
I mean, Nick Mullins had like 2 monster games at the end of last season. We can just get competent play in that system. It can be productive. We've seen it. One last ACL I want to touch on is Daniel Jones. Quarterback ACL. We've done this for the last couple of years. Obviously, 2 years ago we had Joe Burrow coming back from ACL. Last year we had Kyler Murray, and we've seen kind of like the rushing for these guys kind of diminished that first year of the mobility. Even Kyler, like even though he did give us a little bit of running, it was still towards the bottom end of his career production in terms of attempts per game and then, rushing yardage per game. Daniel Jones, everything again, sounding like, the kind of nebulous area right now. He was another late season, ACL. I think it was the first week in November. I don't know if you can correct me. I don't, was it just an ACL? Did he have anything else ancillary with that? But how are we handling Daniel Jones? Because, the team, I mean, Drew Lock definitely is not going to excite anyone either behind him if he has to play.
Now, I think, so first of all, I think Daniel Jones will be ready to start the season. I'm not really concerned about that. To answer your question, yes, it was just an isolated ACL tear. He had really this classic mechanism of the non-contact ACL, right? If you remember when he got hurt, it was week 9. They were playing the Raiders at Allegiant, and he just sort of crumpled in a heap. It was that he just ran and then it looked like his knee folded, and you just, especially as a PT, like, when you see that, you're like, I know what that probably is. And just that little pivot, there's a little shift in the knee and it just sort of gives out on him. And by the way, for all the people who are like, oh, the turf, it's grass. At Allegiant, so a reminder that these injuries can happen anywhere. But a couple things. He, time-wise, it was late, but there's still, and it's not like TJ Hockenson where he didn't have surgery till January, so he still had he has a couple months on that. So if you look at him, he's really going to hit right around the 9-month marker when we get into the season. I also saw Daniel Jones this weekend, and he helps out at Jason Garrett's football camp at Princeton, which I am part of every year. And I just asked him how he was feeling. I try not to give these guys too much if I see him in a setting like that. But he basically says like he feels like he's ready to go, and they're controlling him and they have a plan as far as bringing him back. I love when I see a player is feeling confident because that's a big part of this recovery that I don't think gets enough attention. So the fact that he feels like he could do everything is a really good marker of where he is. And yes, he's a mobile quarterback. He's surprisingly nimble. He was having to scramble for his life. You don't necessarily want that to be the reason that you're getting yardage from your quarterback, but we know that he's mobile and athletic enough to do it. So I don't think that's going to be an issue for him. Very good rehab group with the New York Giants, and they're well versed in this. So I don't have a lot of concern about that. And it's interesting. I'll tell you a little story. Carson Palmer, I don't know if you remember this, but when he had his first ACL tear when he was with Cincinnati, it was a horrible knee injury.
Yep.
He got his knee blown up in the pocket, just kind of tackled, bent every which way. He had extensive damage to his knee beyond the ACL. And then he had a re-tear of his ACL late in his career when he was with Arizona. And I was talking to him at training camp in Arizona that year, just asking him if he had any apprehension about getting back on the field. And he said, not really. He goes, this time I was just sort of stepping up in the pocket. My knee just buckled and gave out. And he goes, but last time, he said that was so hard. And he said when he first was encountering pass rush, even in practice, he would just see like a swarm of color coming at him. And it was so startling. Like he really had to get used to that because he had this fear of getting his knee hit again. And if you had had an injury like that, you would have that fear too. Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. But he didn't really have it the second time. Daniel Jones had a random, his foot planted weird and his knee buckled. I don't think he's going to have a lot of apprehension. I think he's going to move fine. And let's not forget he had a neck injury that may have been more problematic in terms of trying to resolve it. The knee's pretty straightforward. There's a plan. You operate, you do this and that. So the extra time to recover from his knee and work on that probably helps with his neck as well. So I actually kind of like Daniel Jones going into this year.
I mean, everyone that's invested in Malik Neighbors will love to hear that, because I still think Daniel Jones can at least facilitate the football, like especially in the intermediate level. Like we saw Dayball get the best out of him 2 years ago. Yeah, he hasn't played with a guy like Neighbors. Like we haven't, like as much as we've picked on Daniel Jones, and I took a little pot shot at him in the intro there about his passing acumen. Like we haven't seen him play. Yeah, we haven't seen him play with like an actual wide receiver, like a top down like really good wide receiver in his career either. So it'll be the first time we get to see that as well. They did improve the offensive line as much as they could. I guess, they're throwing a lot more new bodies at the offensive line this year. Remember, the Giants gave up 85 sacks last year, and they weren't all Daniel Jones. It was the most since 1986.
I mean, that's not a stat you want to win, right?
No, it's definitely not. But I'm glad that you, outside of, making every Cincinnati fan relive, I think it was Kimo Van Olhoffen that had the hit on Carson Palmer.
Yes, that's good. That's a good. Did you tell the truth? Did you look that up, or did you?
No. I remember. Obviously, I remember that Bengals team was so good.
Impressive.
And they,
yeah.
And that was like the first Bengals team since our days of watching Niners Bengals. That was like the first hope that the Bengals had of like being like a Super Bowl team that year. And I remember that hit just kind of like that happened. I think it happened early in the game. I think it was like the first quarter of the game. It happened.
Yeah. Yep.
And it was just so deflating. I remember even as a fan, just like not of the team, but just the game. It was just like so crippling. But I remember. I'm glad you brought up that about him. The getting hurt in the pocket. One of the biggest misconceptions I think we have, and we've seen some data done on this, is now we're starting to get more influx of the athlete playing quarterback, right? I obviously am known for like the Konami code, that decade, that article's over a decade old now. And what has changed now is that we're just seeing natural human evolution. More athletes are playing quarterback than it was when we were watching football in the 80s, guys like Dan Marino
now.
Yeah, and we have two quarterbacks. Well, the one primary quarterback that is a mobile quarterback that people are going to say, well, look, he ran around and got hurt as a rookie in the small sample as Anthony Richardson. And Anthony Richardson is also not one of these guys like Robert Griffin. Maybe people are having concerns about Jaden Daniels. Like this dude's an absolute tank. Like he's just kind of ran into some bad luck injuries. Obviously, concussion is something that people will point to and say, well, he put himself at risk for that. But the shoulder injury is kind of a little bit more fluky. He's being drafted as the QB5, the QB6 in leagues. We only saw him play 2.5 games basically last year, but on points per dropback, he averaged more fantasy points per dropback than even Josh Allen did. Of course, we can't extrapolate over the full season, but that's what we were working with. Even the game he left in the second quarter, where he had the injury, he had 17 fantasy points and a half. So are there any concerns with Anthony Richardson and his shoulder injury, at this point in the offseason, where we are with him?
I'm not concerned. I know that some people were making a big deal of him having soreness and the Colts backing him off in their last mini camp. This is normal, people. Like
We
this is
saw this with Brock
that's
Purdy
actually
too last year.
this is what you want. Is you want a team to say, you know what, you're a little sore today. We're going to back off. We're not going to do as much the next couple of days because in June, you don't need to be doing that much work. I think they were surprised with how good he looked when he came in. His throwing looks amazing. Like if you consider the nature of the injury that he had, so he had an AC separation, so right at the tip of your shoulder, and it's a fall on the tip of the shoulder. This is a very common quarterback injury, is an AC separation, but usually it's a grade 1 or a grade 2, and it's non-surgical. When you have a more significant AC injury and you have to have surgery to fix it, because in his case, the level of injury that he had, he could not have played with it. So it had to be surgically repaired. Now you're talking about going into the shoulder of a thrower and doing something surgically. So it starts getting a little tricky. Like, is their throwing going to be the same? Are they going to be able to get over the top when they throw the ball without any issue, scar tissue, normal motion, all of that stuff? He had very, renowned, excellent surgeon and Dr. Neil Elatrosh, who has a particular way that he does the approach for this type of surgery. And he has a great physical therapist who's a throwing coach as well, and Tom Gormley, who's down in Jacksonville, plus working with the Colts. So he really, to me, looks so good, because what you're not seeing compensation in his throwing. You're seeing normal rotation in his arm across the body, which is something that often lags in guys who have this type of surgery. They can't really follow through and bring their arm across their body. And if you look at his throwing, he's able to do that. Those are the things that matters more to me in terms of looking at how he's throwing and the way he's doing it and the pattern of his throwing, than whether he's doing 10 reps or 25 and the distance in June mini camps. The volume and all of that will get there by the time the season begins. So not worried about that. And you're right, he's built like a tank. So he's got a lot of protection around that shoulder. And I love Anthony Richardson. I love him. You mentioned the points per dropback. To me, that is a really key stat with him. I don't think they're not going to try and rein in his running. That is not the plan. He is going to continue to be just exactly who he is, and then just continue to evolve as a thrower.
Yeah, and they shouldn't. I mean, it feels like he just has a product of circumstances, bad luck last year. The injuries he had. One player that people don't really kind of know what to kind of put a pulse on based on obviously everything that's surrounded him the last 3 years is Deshaun Watson, but he's also coming off of a shoulder injury. I don't know if it's the same injury or if it's similar. But the last time we did see Deshaun Watson play football, he completed his past 14 passes, and the Browns had a comeback against the Baltimore Ravens in Baltimore, one of the top defenses in the league last year. So we've been kind of waiting to see the Houston version of Deshaun Watson in Cleveland. We have not seen it. It's been very fleeting. As far as like an injury on the injury front, how similar is his injury to Anthony Richardson's, and what can we expect on the timeline for Deshaun Watson?
So not similar at all. Anthony Richardson's injury was at the AC joint, so kind of the point of the shoulder. Deshaun Watson actually had an injury within the shoulder joint, and so he had a glenoid fracture. The glenoid is the socket part of your shoulder joint. So you got the ball and the socket sits on your shoulder blade, your scapula, and then the arm bone, the humerus, goes inside it. So this socket portion on the back part had a fracture, and it was displaced. And displaced means the bones are not in alignment. So they had to go in. Dr. Elatrosh also operated on Deshaun Watson. They had to basically repair that fracture. When you get a fracture like that, you tear the labrum as well. So they had to repair the labrum in the shoulder. Now that you start talking about throwers and torn labrum and repairing that, and the real challenge for a surgeon, and this is where I have so much respect, and it wouldn't be me operating on these elite athletes, knowing that you're talking about windows of a few degrees here and there, because you have to provide enough stability in the shoulder that it feels solid, right? It can't feel like it's slipping out the joint. But you don't want to over constrain it. If you make it too tight, then they can't get their normal arc of throwing, right? If you are so worried about protecting and reinforcing the shoulder when you're repairing it that you don't allow for normal motion, quarterback's not going to be able to make his throws. He's not going to be able to come up over the top in the same way. So, again, that's where I credit the surgeons with being able to do what they do, the rehab folks with being able to help get the player back and get them confident. And my understanding is that Deshaun Watson is throwing very well right now and is on track to start the season. I really didn't know what to expect. It's a tough injury. These are not common in throwers. Anthony Richardson's AC repair, Deshaun Watson, we see torn labrum in throwers, but a glenoid fracture with that kind of the traumatic nature of it makes it a little bit harder to project. It's not like you have a whole list of comps where you can say, oh, this guy had the very same injury and we can point to this. So you look at how they're doing and where their progression is, and it might be tough in terms of volume of work, because when you're Deshaun Watson, you have that injury, all that recovery time. How's your rotator cuff going to be, strength wise? And are you going to be able to handle the volume of throwing? How's your velocity going to be? Are you going to be able to put the same spin on the ball that you always could? And some of those things may take a little bit longer. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't think there's a lot of patience there necessarily in Cleveland for him to get back up. People need to understand this is a very, very tough injury to come back from. But given all the pressure, and this is what happened. You want to get paid a lot of money, more money than has ever been paid at the position, then you have to perform. And I think, you mentioned last year you saw a glimpse of it. He had his best game that he had as a Cleveland Brown right before he got hurt. And so even you remember those little bits where he was trying to come back, and then there was a question about, could he or couldn't he play? And I felt badly in the sense that once you're hurt like that, it changes you as a thrower. And so even though he reportedly didn't have the extent of the injury until, it finally ended his season, he was not going to match that performance that he had as long as he had any kind of injury to his shoulder. So to expect him to suddenly come back and be that guy who had his best game ever right before he got hurt, I don't expect that.
I like that you brought it up, because obviously, Deshaun Watson, he's obviously, a villain for a lot of people and for a reason. But, when you talk about how it could have been impacting his on-field play to that point in the season, separating that, 17% of his throws were inaccurate throws per True Media last year. It was third worst in the NFL, and it was by far the highest rate of his career. So maybe that does apply some context to kind of what we were seeing, and him unable to kind of recapture some of that early career success he had as a thrower. At least the Browns did insulate themselves this year too. They had Jameis Winston, they had Tyler Huntley, versus the gaggle of guys that got them to Joe Flacco last year. So they're a little bit insulated there. The playmakers, two guys that are coming back from the same injury, well, at least top down. You might scoff at me for calling it the same injury, but both had Achilles tears, are Kirk Cousins and Aaron Rodgers. And we care more from a fantasy stance. We like these guys as QB2s and guys we can stream. What we really care about Aaron Rodgers and Kirk Cousins is what they do for the players around them. We right now have two Jets being drafted in the first round of fantasy football. We almost have two Falcons being drafted in the first round. We're hoping for, the Kyle Pitts early career that we saw breakout. We're hoping for the true Kyle Pitts breakout. Could Darnell Mooney be a thing after some kind of fleeting success in Chicago, joining the Falcons? Now, the reason I want to bring up these two players is I have a specific question I want to ask about these Achilles, and I don't know the answer to it. So I'm hoping I believe Aaron Rodgers tore his left Achilles and Kirk Cousins tore his right Achilles. Does it make a difference that one is the plant foot for the quarterback and one isn't?
It can. And so in terms of the demand of the position, it is different. And I would say, not to take anything away from Aaron Rodgers' aggressive rehab program because he was on a trajectory that would have put him in position
He
to play.
almost Jerry Riced it.
I'm not going to say he was going to for sure because we'll never know. But he was in a position to be able to play. And if you recall when he first showed up back at the Jets facility, I think it was it a Monday night game or a Sunday night game?
Yeah, I think he came out
And he was out
pregame.
there on the field doing the throws, and people are like, "Oh my God, he's out there like he just had this surgery. How is he out there throwing?" Well, if it's your front leg, you're just stepping onto basically like a neutral position of your foot. And if you have a shoe that's constructed so that, or a lift within your shoe so that you're not allowed to flex your foot so much that you put undue stress on the Achilles, and you're basically standing there and kind of stepping in to throw, you can do that. It looks a lot more impressive. People are wondering, how is it even possible? I don't think he would have been able to do it if it was his right leg. Because it would put it in a different position. So for Kirk Cousins, with it being his right, you do use that back leg to drive the ball down the field. Like that's where you get some of that push. And it really depends on the thrower. And if you want to get really in the weeds of biomechanics of throwers, you see that some play, do you remember like old, I guess it's geometry classes, geometry or physics, where you can sort of break down this arc of movement into a vertical component and then a horizontal component. And some throwers have a real loft, like a vertical component to their throwing. And a lot of that push, that pop off to throw from the back leg requires your Achilles to push into it. If you're throwing like a bullet straight without much loft, you probably aren't leveraging as much off of your Achilles. But in terms of vertical dimension, that is work from the Achilles. And if there's less explosiveness, which most athletes will tell you that it takes a year, forget how quickly they're coming back, that it takes a good year until they feel like the explosiveness is there. Could that show up in terms of what the throwing looks like? Perhaps. We're not going to know until we see it. But it's possible that it makes it a little more challenging for Kirk Cousins with some of the down the field throws. Not that he can't make them, but might there be an adjustment? Might there be something else he's doing because he's just not getting quite the same power from his back leg? Or is it the demand so low that it doesn't really matter? That's something I can't answer without like being there and studying force plates and looking at what he's actually doing. But that's where we talk about some of the subtleties of these injuries and how they can manifest themselves. That would be one question that I would have. I think Aaron Rodgers, look, he was pushing to come back last year. He was quite far along in his rehab process and potentially was going to be able to join. So the extra time just allows more strengthening, more what we call remodeling of the tendon, kind of shaping that tendon in a way that helps the overall strength of the tissue. That only helps you coming into this year. So I'm not really worried about Aaron Rodgers.
Is to take the camera down?
Yeah,
knock down
I
the
knocked
computer.
something down. Exactly.
Yeah.
I get a little
one
too
last person.
excited, and I'm like knocking things around in my house.
Once you started talking about horizontal trajectory, the computer starts to tip over.
Everybody's like, okay, that's enough.
Well, I know we're against time here, but there's one more player I wanted to touch on, another skill player. Fortunately, we talked largely about quarterbacks and not we don't have like all these major, skill players. We talked about some of the ACLs, for Nick Chubb and Jonathon Brooks. But, last year, one guy I was bullish on the opportunity and, was Tony Pollard. And I didn't really account for, the fibula return, the fractured fibula. And he talked about he didn't feel like himself until, week 10, week 11 last year, feeling 100%. You said that play speed. He was at training camp and everything. Like there was no indication and he had 300 touches, right? But like he said, he didn't feel like himself as a player until, the 3/4 of the way through the season. I did want to kind of tie that into because we have Tank Dell coming back from a fractured fibula. How similar are their injuries? Are they similar at all? And, should there be any cause of concern with Tank Dell, potentially being, not feeling like himself, or that play speed being up 100% to start the season, removing anything from Stephon Diggs' addition?
Yeah, exactly. That could be that's a whole nother aspect to it. I think, Tony Pollard had ankle ligament damage as well. And the thing is, there's so many presentations with these injuries. So the fibula is the skinny bone on the outside of the lower leg. So your tibia is your big shin bone, it's the one that's most obvious down there. Then you have this little skinny bone that runs alongside it, the fibula. And it's important because the bottom piece of that fibula makes up the outer portion of your ankle. Like if you feel your outside ankle bone, that's your fibula there. So usually when we see a fractured fibula, ankle gets torqued and there's a torsional stress, and it will kind of work its way up the fibula and crack it there. So sometimes it's a direct contact, sometimes it's a fracture dislocation of the ankle that involves a lot of other soft tissue, sometimes just a crack of the fibula. So if you have just a crack of the fibula, not a big deal, just 6-week recovery, you don't really do much. If you have surgery to repair it, it means they're putting a plate and screws. There is another device now called the Fibulock made by Arthrex that basically goes up through the shaft of the bone. It's a lower profile than having a plate and screws. I've seen people use it with hockey players and skaters because it doesn't irritate their shoe. But the standard still for most people is a plate and screws. So there's some hardware there. And the main thing is getting motion back around the ankle. That's the key, is how hard is it to get your mobility back? How long does that ankle feel stiff? And a lot of it depends on the nuance of the injury. So I can't really say exactly what Tank Dell had, because I'm not sure how much of that other stuff was involved. But judging from how well he's moving already, and remember, he had that incident, he was shot,
Yes,
and
that's yeah.
and thankfully, they thought that they were going to have to restrict him in the mini camps, and really didn't end up having to. By the end, he was able to do everything and was released unrestricted. So I think that really bodes well for him this year. It's tough as a running back. Tony Pollard's injury was bad. Tony Pollard's injury is part of the reason that the hip drop tackle is now on the map. And it's hard to say. It was against the 49ers when that happened, but it's just bad because the ankle gets torqued so badly. There's a lot of soft tissue damage, and the fibula fracture in that situation may not even be the worst part of the injury. So I understand why it took Tony Pollard a long time to feel normal. I saw him at camp. I thought he looked pretty good. But it's a different animal when you get into competition, and also when you're talking about volume. Even if guys look really good over the course of a few reps or a light workload, remember his workload shifted last year. No more Zeke. I never liked the idea of no Zeke with Tony Pollard because I thought it was going to be a different. I thought that tandem worked well for a lot of reasons, and I wasn't sure that the expectation of what he could deliver was going to be fair and how he would hold up with that. And then you add on top of it, you superimpose that injury coming into the season. I think it was a lot to ask.
Yeah, I think we might live that same situation next year if the Steelers don't retain Najee Harris, because Jalen Warren has very early Tony Pollard vibes to him, to this point in his career. But also, he's not taking on a lot of that grunt work that Tony Pollard took on for the first time in his career, last year. That was great. We were here against the hour. I wish I could talk to you a little bit longer about a couple of these things, especially now that you brought up the hip drop tackle. I was like
oh yeah, I have a lot to say about that.
The hip drop takes, yeah, absolutely. But listen, if you want to hear about that, you can still find Stephania every week on the Fantasy Focus podcast. That's on ESPN. The next episode, I believe, will be this Friday, 12:30 Eastern. Is that every week? Is that just locked in every Friday at 12:30?
Well, it's Fridays right now, but I think when we start going daily on July 29th. So right now we're in the light part, you know how it is.
Yeah,
there's no real off season, but there's an off season. That's where we are right now. And then we'll go daily starting July 29th. And that's around the time, training camps are opening up. So I actually go out to camps, and people who follow me know that's what I do because I like to get my eyeballs on these players who are coming back.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't wait. I always say like 4th of July is always the cutoff. It feels like when everyone comes back from 4th of July, that's like when like it's basically the
Yeah.
season. Like there aren't games, but we're in season. We're getting stuff daily, like on the feed. People are reacting, overreacting, everything's happening post 4th of July. So definitely check out that show. She just had a recent article at ESPN where she went more in depth about a lot of these players. There was no horizontal leverage. I don't think in the article, but maybe you can add that post here. But and then you're going to be doing some more work, for obviously everyone that gets injured, over the course of this preseason. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we don't have anything major, just minor bumps in the road.
I was just gonna say these 6 weeks are like every team's nightmare, jet skis and boating and who knows what recreational sports that they wish they would stay away from. This is everyone crosses their fingers and hopes that
these late summer injuries. I mean, you go back to last year. I mean, we had the Cooper Kupp injury. Travis Kelce got injured, and these are aging players that when you look at their numbers, it's like, oh, the age was built into their declination, but they also played hurt. They started the season behind the 8 ball a little bit. The Christian Watson obviously started last year, but just never could get kind of healthy.
And he's going to be an interesting one with going up to Wisconsin and working with that group up there who I can't say enough about. And they are really, I mean, this is what they are studying is,
do you have a quick spiel on because they did, Alvin Kamara went through something similar last year, correct?
I don't know. Well, he didn't, as far as I know, he didn't go, with this group, but I'm specifically referencing the fact that Christian Watson's had these chronic hamstring injuries, repeat injuries since he came into the league. And, it all came out when he had gone up to Madison, Wisconsin to see the group who is basically studying this right now. They got the $4 million grant from the NFL to study hamstring injuries. And so I went actually to visit them and to learn about their study when it was getting underway. So I'm very familiar with it. Really smart minds up there. And, based on some of the early learnings, I think they were implementing some stuff with Christian Watson, but they took him through some testing and saw where he had these deficits. And it's common after you have these soft tissue injuries that no matter how hard these guys work, these are not deficits that are related to effort, but hamstring is 3 different muscles that combine to make up your big hamstring. And there can be a component of it that is really not working, or it's not working during specific types of activities. And you don't really know if you don't get that feedback or you don't see. And they have imaging that can see where muscle volume is different. They have testing and performance metrics. So they're kind of putting it all together and looking at that. And I think it sounded to me from what Christian Watson was saying that he had a lot more understanding of where those deficits were and what he was trying to fix. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's all super fascinating stuff.
It's incredible. Yeah. Hamstring injuries, by the way, #1 injury burden in the NFL. So ACLs take the longest, but when you add up like lower extremity strains, they are the #1 injury burden. So cost and time missed. And within those, hamstring strains, the greatest, which is why there's a $4 million grant out to study these and see what we can do about it. Because how many guys pull a hamstring? Every position, whether you're in the trenches or you're, elite wide receiver or defensive back whose game is predicated on speed. Everybody pulls a hamstring. And the worst part is that guys come back and they often re-injure it. And, it can be a real problem in terms of costing extensive missed time.
Yeah, it's super fascinating stuff. I love that. We might have to get this to run this back and do hip drop and small studies that the NFL is now investing in to kind of course correct all this hamstring epidemic that we've had for years. Super interesting stuff. As always, you said you can find her on the Fantasy Focus podcast at ESPN. I also want to circle back, go back to sharpfootballanalysis.com. You can pre-order the 2024 preview book. You can sign up for the draft kit that myself and Raymond Summerlin are putting together, and the NFL futures, the first wave of those. You can follow Stephania on Twitter, the former Bird app. We don't refer to it as the X machine. I don't like the logo either. We'll save that for another time too. But at Stephania _ ESPN. On Instagram at Stephania Bell. Definitely follow her throughout the summer, because this is someone that you're going to want to follow for the information, not follow the internet doctors like myself. Follow the real ones. She's Stephania. I'm Rich. We'll be back with next week with the next show of Sharp Football, Sharp Angles. Good luck, everybody.